The lorry carrying 32 German prisoners of war ground to a halt on a cliff road overlooking the North Sea. And for the first time since their capture 3 weeks earlier, during the final collapse of German forces in Holland, the men could see their destination. Below them, nestled in a sheltered cove where green hills met gray water, lay a small British coastal village that looked like something from a painting rather than a real place where actual people lived. The prisoners, mostly Wehrmacht soldiers in their 20s and 30s who had survived years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front before being transferred west for Germany's final defense, pressed against the lorry's sides to get a better view, their faces showing confusion and something close to disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be England. The enemy nation they had been fighting. The country their Luftwaffe had supposedly reduced to rubble. The island that Nazi propaganda had portrayed as a desperate, starving fortress barely surviving under the weight of total war. What shocked them wasn't the village's beauty, though the neat stone cottages with their slate roofs and flower gardens were certainly unlike anything they had seen in years of war. What shocked them, what made several of the prisoners actually ask the British guards if they had somehow been transported to the wrong country, was the silence. There were no air raid sirens, no distant rumble of artillery, no sound of aircraft overhead, no evidence whatsoever that this place existed in a world at war. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbor. Children played in a schoolyard. A woman hung washing on a line behind one of the cottages, the white sheets billowing in the sea breeze. The scene was so utterly, incomprehensibly peaceful that the German prisoners struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they thought they knew about Britain's wartime experience. The guards noticed the prisoners' reactions and were initially puzzled by their obvious shock. To the British soldiers, this was simply a quiet coastal village that had been fortunate enough to escape the Blitz, remote enough that German bombers rarely bothered with it, far enough from military targets that the war had passed it by. But to the German prisoners, who came from cities that had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, who had spent years in landscapes transformed into moonscapes by artillery, who had watched their homeland reduced to rubble while they fought in uniform, the existence of such an untouched place in enemy territory was almost incomprehensible. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Hans Weber, later told a British officer that he had assumed Britain looked like Germany. Cities in ruins, civilians sheltering in basements, infrastructure destroyed, the population living in desperate conditions while their military fought on. The reality of this peaceful village, this place where war seemed to be something happening elsewhere rather than an immediate daily reality, fundamentally challenged his understanding of what the war had meant. The camp where the prisoners were to be housed was located just outside the village, a collection of Nissen huts surrounded by wire fencing, but otherwise unremarkable in appearance. The prisoners were processed with British efficiency, documented, searched, assigned to barracks, given basic orientation about camp rules and expectations. The British commandant, Major Robert Thornton, was a career officer who took his Geneva Convention obligations seriously and who had no interest in treating prisoners with unnecessary harshness. He explained through interpreters that the prisoners would be employed in agricultural work on surrounding farms, that they would receive adequate food and medical care, that they would be permitted to write censored letters home, and that they would remain here until the war ended and repatriation could be arranged. His tone was matter-of-fact, neither friendly nor hostile, the tone of a professional dealing with an administrative matter rather than with hated enemies. What happened over the following days and weeks was a gradual psychological adjustment that many prisoners found more disorienting than their initial capture had been. They were marched each morning to various farms in the area, where they worked under minimal supervision planting crops, repairing fences, performing the countless tasks that British agriculture required, but for which British labor was increasingly unavailable, with so many men still serving in uniform. The work was hard, but not unbearable, and the farmers who employed them treated them with a kind of distant courtesy that seemed to forget they were technically enemies. During lunch breaks, the prisoners could sit in fields overlooking the sea, could watch the village going about its daily business, could observe a society that seemed to function almost normally despite being at war. The silence continued to haunt them. At night in their barracks, lying on bunks that were austere but adequate, the German prisoners would talk about the absence of bombing, the lack of destruction, the normality of British civilian life that they observed from a distance. Many had difficulty believing what they were seeing was representative of Britain as a whole. Surely London must be destroyed. Surely the industrial cities must be rubble. Surely the British population must be suffering, as German civilians suffered. The cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda's portrayal of Britain as a nation on its knees and the reality of this peaceful village existing apparently untouched by war created a kind of psychological crisis for prisoners who had believed they were fighting against an enemy as desperate and damaged as Germany itself had become. One evening, about 2 weeks into their captivity, several prisoners were working late on a farm when the farmer's wife brought out tea and biscuits, a gesture of basic hospitality that seemed to forget they were enemy soldiers. She spoke no German, and they spoke little English, but she sat with them for a few minutes while they drank the tea, asking through gestures about where they were from and whether they had families. When she learned that several had children, she returned to her house and came back with photographs of her own sons, both serving somewhere in the British military, both alive as far as she knew. The prisoners looked at these photographs of young British soldiers who might have killed their comrades or been killed by them, and the sheer ordinariness of the moment, a mother showing photos of her sons to enemy soldiers over tea, seemed to capture something about the war's absurdity that no amount of combat experience had quite conveyed. The psychological impact of the village's silence and normality varied among the prisoners. Some found it comforting, a reminder that civilian life still existed somewhere, even if their own homes had been destroyed. Others found it deeply disturbing, evidence that Germany had lost the war more completely than they had understood. That while German cities burned and German civilians starved, British society had maintained something close to normal functioning. A few prisoners expressed anger, feeling that the disparity was unfair, that if German civilians had to suffer, then British civilians should suffer equally. But most simply felt a kind of exhausted confusion, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality, trying to understand how the war they had fought related to the peace they now observed. Weber, the former schoolteacher, spent his evenings writing in a journal that British censors eventually confiscated, but which contained reflections on what the village's silence meant. He wrote about having believed that modern war was total, that it consumed entire societies, that there could be no peaceful spaces while nations fought for survival. The village proved this belief wrong, demonstrated that even in wartime, some places could remain largely untouched, that the totality of total war was perhaps less total than propaganda suggested. He wrote about watching British children play and wondering whether German children would ever play like that again, whether German villages would ever know such silence, whether the destruction visited on Germany could ever be repaired. His journal entries became increasingly philosophical, questioning not just Nazi propaganda, but the entire framework through which he had understood the war and his participation in it. The British guards and officers noticed the prisoners' reactions to the village, but didn't quite understand their significance. To British observers, the Germans seemed oddly fixated on mundane aspects of civilian life, on things like intact buildings and playing children that hardly seemed noteworthy. Only gradually did some British personnel realize that the prisoners were experiencing a kind of revelation, that the peace and normality of this coastal village was teaching them more about Germany's defeat than any military briefing could have conveyed. The silence they couldn't believe was really the sound of a society that, despite 6 years of war, had maintained enough of its structures and resources to keep some places functioning almost normally. A luxury Germany had lost somewhere in the ruins of its cities and the collapse of its infrastructure.